In today's video, I'm going to walk you through my setup and a few basic tools that I use when designing for the Glowforge using Adobe Illustrator. So first things first, I'm going to open up a document, I'm going to show you how I set it up, and I'm going to walk you through the Pathfinder and Align tools. So we're going to start by creating a new document, ensuring that our unit is set to inches, and setting it to be 20 by 12. The reason we use 20 by 12 is that this matches the workspace aspect ratio and size of the Glowforge interface. So if you open all your documents in 20 by 12, this ensures that the objects that you place will be placed at those exact X and Y coordinates when you actually open it in the Glowforge app. So we're going to leave everything else the same and then hit create. So this brings us up with one 12 by 20 artboard. For anyone who's familiar with Illustrator, you can create multiple artboards. So you can come here to the Artboard tool and hit new and make additional artboards. But it is worth noting that when you upload this document to the Glowforge app, it will only show objects that are on the first artboard. So anything you have on additional artboards, you will either need to move it to this artboard and make the artboard larger, or you'll just have to know that those are not going to show up unless you export them separately. So I'm going to delete that artboard and come back to my main one. Now the next thing you're going to want to look into is actually setting up your workspace in a way that works for you. So I'm currently under a modified layout workspace, but you can swap between these and see what you like. So you can see the essentials is much simpler. Let's not worry about that. And it only has properties, layers, and libraries. And I don't really need access to these in this format, so I'm going to go back to layout. And then I'm actually going to reset the workspace so that we're starting from scratch. So this is what the basic layout workspace looks like. If you find you're missing some of the panels I show, or maybe you're missing your control panel at the top, all you need to do is come to Window and make sure that Control, Application Frame, and Basic Toolbars are checked. If those are unchecked, you'll see that sometimes objects are missing. And I believe Illustrator actually makes this the default now for that to not be there for unknown reasons, because it's very useful. And then same thing down here. So you can check and uncheck which panels you have open. So for example, I don't need the gradient panel. It's not something you're going to really be using for designing vector artwork for the Glowforge, so I'm going to uncheck that. And then I can come back and find some of the panels that I do need. So I don't use the transform panel too much. I actually use it when it pops up in the control. I could uncheck that, but I'll leave it. The main panels that I do want to make sure that I have added to my toolbars are the appearance panel. And this is important because sometimes if you have an error where something is cutting twice, it's because it has a hidden appearance applied to it, and you have to look for that in the appearance panel. So I like to have that panel over here on the right, just in case I need it. I also really want to have the Align panel, which does happen to be right here behind the Transform panel. I'm going to drag it down here, minimize that. And then the last one I really want to show you today is the Pathfinder. So you can see they're popping up all over the place, but the Pathfinder is actually a really helpful panel. I can actually pull out like graphic styles and delete it because I don't need it right now. And then I'm going to drop the Pathfinder there. So these are the three main panels along with the swatches panel that we're going to be working with. And now I'm going to walk you through a couple of the tools. So there are a few tools that you're going to need to become really familiar with. Your selection tool, your direct selection tool, so black arrow and white arrow, your shape tool, your text tool, and then there's quite a few other ones here that you may use. So for example, I use the eyedropper a lot. I also tend to use the magic wand. So I'll show you how those work. So first we have our direct selection tool. That will allow us to grab objects, our main selection tool, and then our direct selection tool will allow us to manipulate them. So if we come to the shape tool and click and hold, you'll see it opens up some other shapes. So let's try that out. So I'm going to pull a star out here. I can actually come to my swatches panel and I can change some little elements here. So for example, I don't want to have that white fill because then it's going to try and engrave that in the Glowforge interface, so I'm going to set that to none. Click the stroke, and I'm going to change the strokes color here. Now, what's kind of cool is if whenever you have a shape selected, if you just click once, it's going to bring a dialog box open that will allow you to individually manipulate that. So for example, if I wanted a 6-pointed star and I wanted it to be set to a 1-inch radius here and then 2.5 here, you can kind of see what that creates, and you can sort of adjust that and play with that. It's the same for things like the rectangle tool. So if I click and say I want a 4 by 4-inch square, I'll be able to create that really easily. So you can see that my black arrow allows me to move objects around. My white arrow is going to allow me to manipulate the anchor points on these vector objects. So vectors are really helpful because they are created using math. So there are mathematical algorithms that are telling this exactly how to form this shape. That means that I could make this star 20 feet by 20 feet and it will still be perfectly crisp and sharp because it's using math, not pixels. So I can take my direct selection tool, I can click individual points, drag them out, and adjust them in whatever way I want. So there may be times where you're going to kind of do something like that. You can also grab these little circles and it will round corners, which is kind of neat. So if I click this, sometimes I need to click with my regular selection tool. I can grab that and I can actually round corners on objects. So these two arrows are going to allow you to manipulate your shapes in a variety of different ways. Now if I have actually, so all of these were very angular shapes. I can also use my pen tool. I'm going to draw a shape, just something kind of interesting. I'm going to create like a little blob. And you can see these little handles. I'm just clicking and dragging to create those. And there's tons of videos out there that talk about using the pen tool, so I'm not going to really get very deep on this. I do use it, but I tend to actually use my tablet and draw with the brush tool more than I use the pen tool now. So I'm just going to kind of gloss over that. But I do want to show you that the direct selection tool will allow you to manipulate and adjust these handles to sort of change your shapes. Another helpful tool when you're working with maybe a file that already has vectors drawn in it and you need to manipulate it is underneath the brush tool, there's something called the smooth tool. And that you can just run it along your shapes and it will try and smooth them out and make them more simple. So if you have sort of like an awkward curve and you're trying to make it a little bit more natural looking, you can just run that tool along your shape and it will sort of help you smooth it out. So for example, if I run it over these angles, it's going to turn them into curves, which there's a lot of different uses for that. So take the time to sort of explore these and kind of play with some of these tools. Just remember, if you click and hold, you can select between a lot of different tools. Another interesting one here is the Blob Brush tool. And I'm going to use my bracket key. My right bracket will allow me to enlarge it. And you can actually sort of just like freeform draw shapes here. And I don't use this all the time because I don't have pressure sensitivity set to this, so it's not particularly useful without the actual tablet to draw. But it does give you a nice freeform shape. You can see I missed a little spot there. But it has all these points, and maybe I have too many points, so I can come back to this tool, grab the smooth tool, smooth out some of my curves, and maybe get like a nicer shape. There's also the erase tool, which works really well with the Blob Brush. And then I can actually erase right out of it. Let's make that a little bigger so you can maybe see. And so there are maybe times where I want to like cut something out of a shape. And that's kind of what happens here. So you can see I have that one selected. So I'm going to select this. And you can see I'm able to delete elements from that shape. Now there's a couple other tools here. I'm not going to get into the shape builder or the gradient tool. Nor am I going to talk about the width tool, the blend tool, or really much more about the Artboard tool. But I do want to show you how the Eyedropper tool works, and this is really, really helpful. So I'm going to make a variety of different little circles here, and I'm going to change their colors. So I'm going to make these two, I'm going to give them a pink fill, and I'm going to leave them with their stroke, but I'm going to bump up the stroke here. Let's make this one filled with red. We'll bump up the stroke. Let's change this one to orange, this one to orange. Highlight both of those and change the stroke color to green. And now this is a pretty simple selection of items here, but let's say you had like 70 of these and you only wanted to select certain ones. You can actually use this magic wand tool to grab like objects. So you can see it's grabbed both of these magenta filled shapes. But sometimes you want to get a little more specific. So I'm going to pull that up and let's change the stroke color on this to orange. And you'll notice if I use the magic wand, it's going to once again select all of the ones with magenta fill. But I may only want to get these ones that also have blue strokes. So to adjust that, double click the magic wand and you can actually change both the tolerance, so like what range of magentas it will grab, and add additional parameters. So if I set these both to 1 and then I select this, you'll notice that it's looking for both stroke and fill color. So it's only going to select objects with the same fill and the same stroke color within a 1 tolerance. So it makes it really easy to kind of adjust things. But then if I pull the tolerance up a lot, you can see these colors are still different enough that it's not going to be a big deal. But maybe if I came into this one and I just slightly changed it, turn off stroke color, you can see now it's grabbing all of these again because it has a higher tolerance. Same thing here. So now with the high tolerance, I'm able to get both red and orange filled objects. So that's just a quick item. You may find that really helpful in the future when you have a lot of objects in your artboard and you're just trying to grab specific things. It also makes a case for making sure you're paying attention to how you're coloring your objects so that you're grouping them by like functions and it's easy to select and adjust them. So now let's get into our shapes and our Pathfinder tool. So we've looked at swatch tool, we have this Pathfinder tool, and we have this align panel here. So these are both really pretty much the bread and butter of, I think, designing a lot of functional objects for the Glowforge. So let's delete some of this and let's take a look at how these function. So I'm going to make some new circles. I'm just holding shift to make these really quick. And I'm going to turn off the stroke for both of these by grabbing them both, humming a stroke, and hitting none. And now let me show you how these different Pathfinder modes work. So if you hover over them, it will tell you what they do. So we have unite, minus front, intersect, and exclude. And let's look at what each of those does. So if we highlight both shapes, it's actually changed the color really quick just so you can see a little bit better. If we grab both these shapes and we hit unite, they will fuse together and then adopt the color of the object on top. I'm going to undo. Now if we hit minus front, it's going to take the first object like a cookie cutter and cut the object behind it. If we hit intersect, it's going to take wherever it overlaps and create a new object. And if we hit exclude, it's going to do the opposite. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use that. It's really very helpful. But one thing you may want to note is if you have a lot of objects, you're not necessarily going to get what you think you are. So you can see you can unite multiple objects. You can minus front multiple objects, intersect, and then exclude. But sometimes you may run into a problem when you get down to these shapes. So let's look at what these ones do. So these are the shape modes. And now we're going to look at the Pathfinders. We have divide, trim, merge, crop, outline, and minus back. So the main ones that I'm really using are divide and then outline. Crop is also something I sometimes use, and I'll show you how that one works as well. So if we have all of our objects highlighted and we hit divide, unlike these ones here, it's just going to slice everywhere that there's an overlap. Now it doesn't look like much happened, but if I right mouse click and hit ungroup, you'll see that every overlap is now an individual object. So there's a lot of different ways I can create some unique shapes with that. there's a lot of times that I use it. I'm struggling to find a perfect example, but this is a very, very useful item when you're trying to just grab a lot of little parts without deleting them. Now let's hit undo and go back. Make sure, there we go. Now the next one that I sometimes use is, let's talk about crop. So I'm not going to get really, really deep into what this does, but I'm actually going to create a clipping mask. So a clipping mask is where you create basically a window and then you crop everything within that window. So for example, I'm going to make this a little smaller. I'm going to set it on top. I'm going to highlight everything, right mouse click, and hit make clipping mask. And what that's going to do is that's going to crop everything, but you can see the objects still exist in the window and I can adjust them. But once I'm done doing that, all I have to do is grab this object and hit crop, and it will delete everything that was out there. So you can see now it has actually cropped them using the clipping mask. So essentially, if you have a much more complex pattern that you're trying to crop into a smaller shape, this will help you both save file size and then also kind of give you these shapes if this is what you're actually looking for. So there's a lot of different ways you can use that. So now this final one that I'm going to talk about is outline. And outline is actually really, really helpful. So the way you would use outline, and this is a common problem a lot of people ask about, but they're not really, most people are not aware that this is a function in Illustrator. So let's say you have multiple objects that are exactly, they don't even have to be the same, but you have a variety of different objects and you want to nest them together in the best way possible and minimize the amount of cuts. Now I've layered these rectangles and they're exactly aligned, but if I were to upload this as it is into the Glowforge, it's going to cut twice anywhere that these lines overlap because this rectangle has a side and then these two also have sides. So it's actually two lines right there. Now the outline function will allow you to delete overlapping lines. So if you have objects that are just set to stroke like this, so no fills, and then you have them sort of layered on top of each other and then you hit outline, the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to look like they disappeared, and this is where everyone gets really confused. Simply re-grab the objects and then reapply a stroke to them. And you will see that they're still grouped, so let's ungroup them. But now it's actually sliced everything so that there's only one line. Now you just kind of leave them together. The Glowforge may cut these in like different sections. Generally, I think the algorithm it uses will figure out to do that as one line. But either way, this will solve the problem of having multiple overlapping lines. And if it is really a problem that these lines are broken apart, one thing you can do is you can take your direct selection or your white arrow, grab the connection, and I believe it's go to Object, Path, and Join. I know it by the keyboard command, Command J, and you can see that has reconnected that together. So there may be a situation where you feel you need to reconnect them, and you can just highlight the connections, hit Command J, and it will fuse it back into essentially a single line. And then I can move that back down here. Now, I don't usually go through the effort of reconnecting them. It will cut fine. You just want to make sure that everything stays grouped so you don't break it all apart and have a bunch of little chunks going everywhere. So that is outline. We talked about crop, which basically deletes the objects in the outer part of the mask. I don't usually use merge too often. Trim is they're essentially very similar to these ones up here. I don't use this one too much. And then divide. My main ones here are going to be unite, minus front, divide, crop, and outline. So that should give you the sort of first little primer on the Pathfinder tool. And there's a lot more to it that we can get into at some later time, and there's tons of videos on it. But I just want to give you a hint of what you can do with this when designing for the Glowforge. Now, the final thing I want to kind of go over is this align panel really quickly. So I'm going to take my shape tool and I'm going to make a ton of circles again. And let's say that I need all of these circles to be in a line. Now, a lot of people who are new to Illustrator will sit there and they will scoot them one by one and wait for them to snap onto the grid. I'm not going to do that. I am just going to highlight all of the objects, and then I'm going to hit horizontal align center, and that's going to align them. What's also really neat is you can also distribute objects evenly on a grid. So I'm going to create one rectangle. I'm going to hit copy, and I can hit paste, or I can hit on Mac the Alt key and drag and just make a bunch of these little guys. Let's say I make one way down here. I can grab all of these and I can actually hit distribute vertical centers and it will space them evenly. So there's a lot of different applications, or maybe you're making something that needed even spacing, or like ruler guides or something. You can use these distribute objects. And then the rest of these are relatively self-explanatory. For example, if I take my circles again and I hit align right, it's going to align them to the right. I can hit align left, align top, align on the center, and then align on the bottom. And now that looks a little funny, but if I rotated it, you would see it essentially works the same. So I can align them to the top, align them to the center, and align them to the bottom. One little thing you might also want to know is you can select what you're aligning to. So you can align to the selection, aka all of the objects you have selected, to a key object. So you can choose one of the objects to align to, or align to Artboard. And let's look at that one first. So if I hit align to Artboard and then I hit distribute, you can see it will distribute it across the entire Artboard. If I want to show that align to key object, let's say I make a rectangle, I'm going to highlight everything, select align to key object, and then you have to click the object you want to be the key object. And then I can hit distribute, or I can hit, hold on, let's hit align. Did I get, oh, nope, I went back to Artboard, that's why. Align to key object, make sure your object is selected, and then you should be able to align to it. And it seems like it's defaulting back, but let's try that one more time. There we go. So it looks like it already figured out which key object I was looking for, and you can see it's aligning to the center of that object, to the left of that object, to the right of that object, to the bottom of that object, etc. So the align tool can be really great for creating evenly spaced items, for getting things onto a grid, or just like distributing and spacing objects across space. So I really like to use this align tool. There's a couple other ones. You can also horizontally distribute space using a specific space. So if I grab this, I'm going to go back to selection, and then you can see it's going to make the space between the objects even. So it's a little different than this one, where it's distributing based on the center point. So there's a lot of different really great ways you can use these types of things together. But the Pathfinder, the align tool, and then the shape panel are really the main things that I'm using to design a lot of my files. So I'm easily able to build like objects with tabs. Let's say I wanted to add like a tab to this. Maybe I click and I know I need that tab to be 0.25 by a height of 0.5. I can make those tabs, come over here, connect it to the object, and merge it. I mean, there's just an infinite way that you can use just these basic tools to sort of create, like tons of different artwork, functional objects that build together like boxes and tabs, to nest your artwork in ways that make the cutting more simple, and a lot of other things. So that's kind of part one of this introduction to Illustrator. We can look into some more advanced techniques next time, but I want to get you guys started with this. So if you're new to Illustrator, I suggest you just start with these few tools: your arrows, your shape tool, and then your align and your Pathfinder, and see what you can build using that. So good luck, and if you have any questions, just let me know, and I'll try to address them in the next video.